This is question number 6 on the titration curves worksheet, and we are told that we have equal volumes of two acids, acid A and acid B, and they are titrated both with 0.1 molar NaOH. Which curve, A or B, corresponds to the more concentrated acid solution? Well, since we have equal volumes of the two acids, whichever one requires more moles of NaOH will be the more concentrated. So whichever requires more moles of NaOH to get to the equivalence point is the more concentrated. I think we can assume that both of these acids are monoprotic. So what we would have is we would have HA, for example, plus NaOH. That's a 1-to-1 ratio. And so the more moles of NaOH we have, the more moles of HA we would have. And because the acids are in the equal volumes, whichever one has more moles in that volume will be the more concentrated. You might just be able to tell by looking at the diagram that A requires less volume of NaOH than B, and so A, to get to the equivalence point, to react all of the acids, so there must be less acid, and so A is going to be less concentrated. B is going to require about 35 moles more, or sorry, not 35 moles, it's going to require 35 milliliters of the NaOH to get to the equivalence point. And so B will be more concentrated. But we can prove that if you'd like to go through that. So our millimoles of NaOH for A are, that looks like about 24 milliliters. 24 milliliters times 0.1 moles of NaOH per liter, and we get 2.4 millimoles of NaOH, which means that we have 2.4 millimoles of acid A, let's call it HA. And for acid B, the millimoles of NaOH looks to be about 35 milliliters. So 35 milliliters times 0.1 moles per liter equals 3.5 moles of NaOH. And that means, because they will still, HB will also react in a 1-to-1 fashion with the NaOH, we would have 3.5 millimoles of HB. And because these two are in the same volume, the one with more millimoles will be the more concentrated. And that's it.
So part B, which corresponds to the acid with the larger Ka, well, the larger Ka, that means the stronger the acid. And if you actually have a strong acid, the pH at the equivalence point what will the pH be at the equivalence point if we had a strong acid being titrated by NaOH? Yeah, it's going to be 7. And when we have a weak acid, titrated by a strong base, the pH at the equivalence point will be, yeah, it's going to be greater than 7. And so from that, you can make a generalization. If a strong acid is 7 and a weak acid is greater than 7, then the weaker the acid, the greater the pH at the equivalence point. So the weaker the acid, the greater the pH at the equivalence point. Yeah, and if you have, if you are a weaker acid, that means that your Ka value is it bigger or is it smaller? If you have a weaker acid, the Ka is, yeah, smaller. So the greater the pH, the smaller the Ka. The greater the pH at the equivalence point, the smaller the Ka. So if we look up at our graphs, the pH at the equivalence point for A is about pH, I don't know, 9.1 or something like that. And for B, it is about maybe 8.2. And what that means is that acid A is weaker than acid B. And that means that the acid B has a larger Ka and acid A has a smaller Ka. Okie dokie, so that means that acid B then has the larger Ka because its pH at the equivalence point is lower. Are we good with that? Yes, all right. Are there any other questions from this titration worksheet, titration curve worksheet? Well, alrighty then. Does anyone have any questions from the acid base 2 review? I don't know if any of you have even started it yet, but just in case. Anybody have any questions from there? No, not yet. Okay. Well, if that's the case, today's meeting might be really, really short. Is there anything else anyone might like to go over today? Because if not, then I can simply send you off to go do some practice reviewing acid base 2. Alrighty then. So homework, let's just see how many questions do we have in the multiple choice? I think there's a lot. There's like 64. So what if I assigned half of those to be due on Monday? So 32 multiple choice questions. Are we good with that? Multiple choice number 1 through 32? Okay, so let's do that. Multiple choice number 1 through 32, and that'll be due on Monday. And again, on Monday, we're mainly just going to go over these. This is sort of a review week for all the acid-base part 2 stuff.